Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to an in-depth review on Shadow of War, a proper sequel to the previous game, Shadow of Mordor, that expands and improves upon just about everything that the first one had to offer. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the visuals. Artistically speaking, the game shares a very similar appearance to Shadow of Mordor. However, graphically, the game looks noticeably better in all areas. A problem I had with the first game was that the landscape felt very cubic, and to be fair, you do still get a little bit of that same feeling here, but for the most part, they've actually done a much better job at making the environment feel far more natural. And speaking of that playable area, Shadow of War offers a total of 5 playable regions, each one being around the same size as a zone from Shadow of Mordor. Except looking back, that game only had 2. So effectively you have more than double the content here, which is not something a lot of games can say these days. I also want to mention that with Shadow of War, you get a much greater sense of scale. And more importantly, each one of the zones presents a much different experience compared to all the others. One moment you could be sneaking through the mountain pass of Saragost.
I hear the boys have got another.
And the next you might be battling your way through the fires near Mount Doom. And in a similar fashion, the atmosphere of the game also takes on some much needed variety. And for those who enjoyed the gloomy feeling of the first game, you'll still get some of that here. But in addition to that, you also end up seeing things like a gorgeous sunset or an eerily moonlit night. With all of that said, it's about time we start talking about how all of the various characters stack up. And since the orcs seem to be the main focus of this game, let's go ahead and start with them. Honestly guys, no complaints here. In fact, after already putting in around 60 hours, even now I continue to see a unique collection of orcs. Everything from the armor they wear to the scars on their face, you know what, make that 2 faces in some cases, can be different. And it's all decided by factors such as which orc tribe they derive from, and also all sorts of history they may have acquired over time. Not to mention, many of the orcs' appearances will actually change due to encounters they may have shared with the player. For instance, burning them might result in a melted face, and then cutting their body parts off may require them to get a new metal limb, should they come back. Now, what about the other creatures of Middle-earth? Well, for me, these were mostly a hit or a miss, and once again, there was definitely more variety this time around, but I've always found animals like the Caragor to be a little underwhelming, and they never really felt as intimidating as, say, the wolves of Isengard. And the exact same thing goes for the ring wraiths as well. Just something about them being ghostly the entire time, with that sort of green hue, never compared to the ones donned in black from the films. On the other hand, I really enjoyed how they handled the main character, Talion, even though at first I wasn't a huge fan of his new face, but come the end of the game I started to prefer it to the original. Likewise, you can change all of Talion's gear now as well, which includes his armor, cape, sword, dagger, bow, and even the ring. Now I must say you do run into a few repeats from time to time, but to me that made finding some of the legendary stuff all the more exciting. And all in all, visually the only issues I had here were the occasional clipping of objects or characters, as well as a tiny black box that would appear in the corner of my screen from time to time, which I'm sure you'll see quite a bit in the footage shown here. Next up, let's go ahead and move on to the gameplay. This was without a doubt one of the best parts about this game for me, though that's not to say that it went without its flaws. I actually ended up running into quite a few bugs. Thankfully though, none of them were anywhere near game breaking, and for the most part, they were just small, annoying issues, like not being able to exit a rope properly, or the game thinking that I wanted to roll instead of jump over an object. However, pretty much all of that gets pushed to the back of your head after you experience the joy that the rest of this game has to offer. And just like Shadow of Mordor, you end up with your fair share of side missions, which usually teach you some of the game's new mechanics, such as commanding companions. And of course, there's also the main story, which we'll get into later. And finally, there's an essentially infinite number of orc missions. None of these are required to complete, but unlike the Radiant quests that you would find in most games, these are actually a good amount of fun. And they always involve different orcs doing different things in different areas. So rarely does it ever get too repetitive. And just to give you some examples of what these entail, just imagine coming across anything from a supply raid to a troll trying to face off against a grog. And if you've played the first game, there's also several new events, like the fighting pits, in which you can have two orcs go head to head in a fight to the death. Thus resulting in the winner becoming that much stronger. Apart from these missions though, there are so many small details that really make this game what it is. And nothing beats running into that orc that you thought you killed hours ago, or having one of your many lives flash before your eyes, only to have it be saved at the very last second. Believe it or not, my favorite encounter involved me getting betrayed by a group of my own orcs, including my most loyal one brought over from Shadow of Mordor, and then during that very same fight I was saved by another one of my orc brothers. Orcs also have a ton of new abilities that were lacking from the first game, and some even adapt mid-combat to moves that you might be using a bit too much. Couple this with the sheer amount of options you have regarding the difficulty and the HUD, and this game becomes as difficult as you make it. I, for instance, played through the game on normal, but also chose to turn off a lot of the HUD so I couldn't see where enemies were coming from or what my health was at. And you could take this even further by turning off other elements such as the block icon to really test your skills. And perhaps my favorite addition was the inclusion of the Olog High, or War Trolls. These guys do a really nice job at mixing up combat, and to me they were one of the main things that were lacking from the first game, mainly because of the sense of scale that they bring to every battle. And speaking of those battles, sure you still have a ton of small encounters, like pissing off a troll by shooting his grog.
What's dead, boy? What do you think you do? My grog! My grog! I tear you to pieces and drain your blood!
However, a large portion of this game revolves around you and the new siege system. And no matter which side of the wall you're on, the game does a great job at allowing you to choose which orcs and which equipment you bring to the table, such as mounted archers or spike walls. Hell, even the appearance of the fortress ends up changing depending on which orc sits on the throne. And finally taking a fortress back from that orc who's been kicking your ass the entire time feels truly rewarding.
Another attempt? As if this one could end any differently. Why do you insist on wasting your time and mine?
Moving on, let's talk about the sound. And starting with the music, I'd have to say that things sound pretty good, but despite that, and despite the fact that it feels like it belongs in Middle-earth, the soundtrack still falls far short of both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogies. And I think due to the licensing, we actually end up missing out on quite a few of the iconic sounds, like the screams of the Nazgul. even though the ring wraiths are in a good chunk of this game. Aside from those issues though, most of the other sounds in this game feel authentic, and also as though they have an actual impact on what's happening, especially when you're chopping up orcs.
Do your worst. It'll pale next to what I've done.
And, in terms of the voice, this is where the sound design really excels, because they did a fantastic job at making sure every orc felt unique. And even outside of the close-up dialogue, you end up hearing all kinds of crazy stories told by the orcs.
Yeah, I've been around a while, I have. Got a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom. Wouldn't think it to look at me, would ya? But, for instance, did you know the reason you drown underwater is because there's no air down there? And that's just one thing. I mean, I know loads more.
And there's even a ton of other cool moments to be had here. The point is, as a package, the excellent sound design does a great job at allowing you to feel as though you really are in the Middle-earth universe. Last but not least, and without mentioning any spoilers, let's briefly cover the story. Right off the bat, I can say for any newcomers, jumping into this one shouldn't really be an issue, as the game starts out with a beefy Lord of the Rings style prologue. And during your time in the game, there's a very interesting dynamic between Talion and his Wraith counterpart as they struggle to decide what's right for Middle-earth as they try and take it back. In general, the story is far better than the original, but I still wouldn't go as far as saying that it's superb. Sure, you have a few missions that were really well done and actually caught me by surprise, and to me that's one of the main signs of a good story, and this one even offered a bit of mystery. But on the other hand, you also end up with a handful of very underwhelming missions, and just a few too many for me to end up calling this a great story. But in total, you do end up with a ton of awesome history that connects this universe to the already established ones, which was a huge bonus for me, and easily one of my favorite parts about this game. Nonetheless, there is still one fatal flaw that I just have to bring up, and that's the overly stretched out Act 4. Effectively locking what most would consider to be the game's true ending behind hours and hours of essentially doing the same thing over and over. It's admittedly very fun at first, and I still highly recommend that you push through it if you have the time, just because of how much I enjoyed that final ending. But with that said, I can't help but get the feeling that this part of the game was stretched out for the wrong reasons. Some will argue it's locked behind microtransactions. However, I can honestly say that throughout my entire time in the game, I never once felt the need to pay a dime, and that's the way it should be. Do I think the microtransactions should have been there to begin with? Absolutely not. But at the very least, I can definitely tell that they put in a real effort to make sure this game was really balanced. And with all of that out of the way, it's time to give this game a final score. And even at $60, I can still say that this game is well worth it. And it earns itself an 8 out of 10 in my book. It's without a doubt a must-play for anyone who is a fan of the first game or just the Middle-earth universe. But yeah guys, that should do it for today. So hopefully you enjoyed the review. Feel free to let me know what you thought down in the comments. And as always, I will see you in the next one.